My name is Martin Ragcon. I write a column for the Toronto Star, not on Iranian affairs, but on Ontario politics. But in a previous life, I used to be a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star and was based in the Middle East and was in Iran a few times in the mid to late 1990s, which is where I first met the famous Nazila Fathi, who was then the correspondent, the resident correspondent for the New York Times in Tehran, the one and only, and a very big deal. So if you were a visiting or a parachuting foreign correspondent in Iran, you were very much at the mercy of Nazila and her kindness and courtesy. So if she smiled upon you and shared her wisdom, she could make you look very smart. If she didn't, then you were on your own. So as I say, I met her then, and my translator who was helping me made sure to pick her brain and ask for advice so that that's how it worked. Everybody helped everybody else. At the time, I was struck by her and everybody else who was working in journalism by what my translator called Persian pleasantries. Very polite, everything is very courteous and sweet and thoughtful. But you quickly learn that, especially with the journalists who work in Iran and who survive in Iran, that they are very tough inside. And you will see that or read that when you hear Nazila and when you read her book. I think I have a copy in my backpack. I will do the commercial shortly when I sit down. It's a terrific book, but we'll come to more of that in a minute. We crossed paths again about 10 years later when she wound up back in Toronto. While I was abroad, she had been here getting her master's at U of T, I believe. And when we reconnected, it was in about 2008, after I'm losing track of my colors, the Green Revolution, yes? Okay, 2009. And Nazila had to escape from Iran. She was under the gun, literally, figuratively, and had to leave with her family on very short notice to escape the fate of other journalists who have been imprisoned, detained, and met other very sad fates. So at the time when we reconnected, she told me about what had happened to her in Iran, and so naturally, as a journalist, I wrote about it back in 2009 in a column. I was writing a weekly column then on foreign affairs, and it was a very awkward position to be writing about somebody who was no longer able to practice her craft in Tehran. Instead, she had migrated to Toronto, and quite remarkably, if you were reading the New York Times back then, you would see her byline, but with a Toronto dateline. And so for several months at least, maybe even a year, she was working her sources, using the internet, sat phones, and various other ways of communicating to get the story on the ground. A lot of other Iranian journalists had to themselves leave Iran. So she kept that up for about a year or so, and then ended up doing a number of fellowships, the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, a couple of other fancy-sounding fellowships. And after a few years of this, and people asking her, like me, to tell them her story, she decided to write her own story, and hence her book, which is both a personal memoir, but also tells the story of Iran's revolution over the last few decades, the narrative of a country that really was undergoing a tremendous amount of turmoil, which you all know about and have read about over the years. But hearing her, in her own voice, tell that story, you almost relive it through her as a young girl, and then a young woman, and then a young journalist, and still a young journalist, with a remarkable sense of context and connections. So, one last thought. The thing about Nazila that I've always admired is that when other foreign correspondents would come into Iran, flying blind and benefiting from her expertise and the expertise of other very brave translators who were on the ground. I named my daughter after one of them, Hale, in fact. Nazila was the third choice. So the thing is that these journalists would parachute in, but then they would fly out when things got tough. And when their visas were canceled or expired, they had to leave. And they would say, oh, I really want to stay, but actually they would be safe and sound back home after the bullets started flying, or the police batons, or Basiji batons, to be more specific here, would be hurled at people. And Nazila was always staying behind until she absolutely couldn't, to save herself and her family in particular. But I always admire that bravery, and without further ado, I'm going to let her tell you about that. So Nazila, over to you.